The lecture hall at Whitmore University fell into a brittle silence as Professor Eleanor Hayes finished writing the equation across the board. She turned chalk dust still clinging to her sleeve, her eyes sweeping the room like a blade. In more than 2 decades of teaching, no student has ever solved this. Who thinks they can? Not a single hand moved. Rows of the brightest minds in the country stared at their desks. Then, from the back, a man in a gray janitor's uniform slowly stood up and raised his hand. Someone laughed. He didn't lower it. Whitmore University sat on a hill above the city, its limestone buildings softened by decades of ivy and the quiet arrogance of old money. Inside the mathematics wing, the hall smelled of floor wax and paper. Late at night, when the seminars were long over and the coffee machines had gone cold, a single figure moved through the corridors with a mop bucket and a ring of keys. Adrian Cole had worked the overnight shift at Whitmore for almost 4 years. His hours ran from 10 in the evening until 7 the next morning, and most of the faculty had never learned his name. The ones who had called him simply Cole, if they called him anything at all. He cleaned Lecture Hall 2 every weeknight at 10. By that hour, the whiteboards were still covered in the day's work, half-erased equations bleeding into one another like tide lines. Adrian had a habit of standing in front of them before he wiped them down, reading what had been written, turning the problems over in his mind, the way another man might turn a coin. He kept a small notebook in his back pocket. Sometimes, after everyone else had gone home, he would sit in the 3rd row with the overhead lights off and copy something out just to see if he could follow it. Other nights, walking the long way home along Cromwell Avenue at 4 in the morning, he would turn the same problems over again against the sound of his own footsteps. He had not always carried a mop. There had been another version of his life years ago with graduate applications and scholarship letters, and a professor in Ohio who had written him a recommendation that called him the most original mind in the department. Then there had been an illness in the family, and then a funeral, and then the kind of bills that turn ambition into an expense a man can no longer afford. He had come to Whitmore because the night shift paid $18 an hour and left his days free for the responsibilities no one else was going to carry for him. He did not wear a wedding ring anymore, though the band of paler skin where it had been had never quite faded. Professor Eleanor Hayes was the kind of figure a university kept, for the same reason it kept old portraits, because her presence reminded everyone of what the institution believed it was. She had published her first major paper at 26, chaired the department by 40, and now at 53, she taught only 1 undergraduate course a semester. That course, Advanced Analytical Methods, was legendary. She was said to have failed more honors students than any other professor in the university's history, and she was said to be proud of it. On the Tuesday morning that everything changed, Adrian was still on the clock an hour after his shift was supposed to end. A water line above the corridor adjoining Lecture Hall 2 had begun leaking sometime before 6, and the facilities office had asked him to stay past 7 to contain the damage and move the ceiling tiles that had come down in the night. By the time he finished the last of it, the hall next door had already begun to fill with students for the 8:30 session. He stepped into the back row of Lecture Hall 2 to gather the last of his supplies, and Professor Hayes walked in through the front door. He moved to leave, but she had already begun writing on the board, and something about the sound of the chalk held him in place. She wrote without turning around. The equation grew across the board in her precise, narrow hand, running from the upper left corner almost to the lower right. It was not a textbook problem. Adrian recognized that within the first few lines. The structure of it was unusual, a hybrid of number theory and analysis that seemed to refuse every standard approach. By the time she finished, the room of roughly 40 students had gone completely still. She set the chalk down on the tray and turned to face them, brushing white dust from her sleeve with the back of her hand. "I want you to look at this carefully," she said. "This problem has been on the board of my office in one form or another for more than a decade. I have given it every year to the best minds this university will admit. Graduate students, Fulbright finalists, A young man last spring who had already published in 2 peer-reviewed journals. Not one of them has solved it. She let her gaze move slowly across the rows of faces. In more than 20 years of teaching, I have never seen a student get past the 3rd line without making an error that collapses the rest of the proof. So, who thinks they can? No hand moved. Adrian, standing in the shadow at the back of the hall, felt his own breath grow shallow. He had seen the problem before. Not this exact version, but the shape of it, the bones underneath. He had been thinking about a problem like this for almost 2 years in the quiet hours after midnight, in a notebook he had never shown to anyone. He knew what was wrong with the conventional approach. He knew why every student Hayes had ever given this to had failed. He also knew what it looked like for a man in a gray uniform to raise his hand in a room full of Whitmore undergraduates. He thought about it for a long moment. He thought about the bucket at his feet, and the keys on his belt, and the paler band of skin on his finger. And then, without quite deciding to, he raised his hand. The student in the row ahead of him turned first a boy in a navy crewneck with the Whitmore crest on the chest. His expression cycled through confusion, amusement, and something close to embarrassment on Adrian's behalf. The boy elbowed the student next to him, a blonde young woman with a laptop open to a page of notes, and she looked up, and then she looked back, and then she laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was worse than that. It was the laugh of someone who has been offered a joke she did not realize was coming, and is grateful for the break in the tension. Her laughter traveled. Within a few seconds, half the room had turned to stare. A tall student near the front, who Adrian had seen in the hall a few times, a young man named Tyler Brennan, who was known as the strongest student in the course, let out a short, incredulous breath and muttered something to the girl beside him that Adrian could not hear. Other faces joined in, some smirking, some simply baffled, a few openly shaking their heads. At the front of the room, Professor Hayes did not laugh. She looked at Adrian the way a surgeon looks at an unexpected shadow on a scan, with sharp, unsentimental curiosity. Her eyes moved from his face, to the uniform, to the ID badge clipped to his breast pocket, and then back to his face again. "You work here," she said. It was not a question. It was the establishment of a fact, placed carefully on the table between them so that everyone in the room could see it. "Yes, ma'am," Adrian said. His voice was steadier than he had expected. "And you believe you can solve this problem?" "I believe I can try." Something flickered behind her eyes. It was not respect. It was not yet contempt. It was the expression of a woman who had been handed, after so many years, a variable she had not accounted for. She glanced once at the board, once at her watch, and once at the rows of students who were now watching her as intently as they had been watching him. Then she stepped back from the chalk tray and gestured with an open palm toward the board. "By all means, Mr. Cole," she said. "Come up." Adrian set the bucket down against the wall and walked up the center aisle. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter than they had a minute before, and the distance between the back row and the whiteboard felt longer than the room itself. He passed Tyler Brennan, who did not bother to hide his smirk, and the blonde young woman who had already lifted her phone to film. By the time he reached the front, his hands had steadied. He wiped them once against the side of his uniform and picked up a piece of chalk from the tray. Professor Hayes stepped to the side and folded her arms. She did not move to the lectern or to her desk. She stood 3 feet from the board, close enough that Adrian could hear her breathing, and watched. The message was clear. She intended to witness every line he wrote, and she intended everyone in the room to know she was witnessing it. Adrian read the equation through one more time. He did not start where a student would have started. He did not reach for the standard substitution that the first 3 lines of the problem seemed to invite. Instead, he drew a small bracket beneath the middle of the expression and began to rewrite a single term. He was changing the frame of the problem before he touched its contents. A murmur moved through the front rows almost at once. Tyler Brennan leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "He's rewriting the function," he said, loud enough to carry. "That's not even the right variable." The blonde young woman, whose name Adrian would later learn, was Megan Prescott, let out a small laugh and shook her head. A student in the second row whispered something to his neighbor that drew a grin. Professor Hayes said nothing. Her eyes did not leave the board. Adrian kept working. He wrote a second line beneath the first, then a third each step, moving further away from the form of the original equation and deeper into a structure of his own. The chalk tapped lightly against the board. He could feel the sweat beginning at the small of his back, not from fear, but from concentration, the kind he used to feel as a young man in another state, at another desk, in a life he had mostly stopped letting himself remember. By the fifth line, the quality of the whispering in the room had begun to change. The laughter had thinned. Megan Prescott lowered her phone a few inches. The boy in the navy crewneck, whose name was Caleb Whitaker, and who was sitting beside Tyler, leaned forward, with a small crease forming between his eyebrows. He was one of the strongest students in the course alongside Tyler. He had just realized that he did not know what Adrian was doing, and he had also just realized that not knowing did not necessarily mean Adrian was wrong. Adrian reached the point in the proof where the original problem structure seemed to demand a particular identity, a well-known manipulation that every textbook in the country would have applied at exactly that step. He ignored it. He wrote instead a transformation that treated the entire left side of the equation as a single object rather than a sum of parts. Then he drew a horizontal line across the board and began again beneath it, rebuilding the problem from a different foundation. This was the midpoint. He could feel it in the silence behind him as much as he could see it in the shape of what he was writing. The room, which had been a room of mockery a few minutes before, had become something else. It had become a room of attention. Professor Hayes had uncrossed her arms. Her right hand had risen to her mouth, her index finger pressed lightly against her lips, the posture she took when she was reading a manuscript, and something in it had surprised her. Caleb Whitaker was the first to say it aloud. He leaned toward Tyler and spoke without taking his eyes off the board. "He's not using the standard substitution. He's restructuring the whole thing from the ground up." Tyler, whose jaw had tightened, did not answer. A few rows back, someone whispered, "Is that even allowed?" And someone else in a lower voice whispered back, "If it works, it's allowed." Adrian heard them the way a man hears traffic from a distant street. He had entered the place in his mind where the problem was the only thing in the world, and the chalk in his hand was the only tool he needed. He reached a step that required him to expand a bracket, and he did it quickly, the way a man does a thing he has practiced many times, and moved on. Then he made the mistake. It was small. It was the kind of mistake a tired man makes in the 15th minute of a proof he has been holding in his head for 2 years. He carried a negative sign incorrectly across a transformation, turning a subtraction into an addition 3 lines above where he was working. For a moment he did not notice. He kept writing, and the next 2 lines, built on the error, began to drift away from the shape the proof needed to take. Megan Prescott caught it before he did. She sat up straight and said, not quite loud enough to be an announcement, but loud enough for Professor Hayes to hear, "The sign is wrong. On the 4th line, the sign is wrong." Heads turned. Other students began to check. Tyler Brennan, whose disappointment at Adrian's early competence had been visible, now sat forward with something like relief. "She's right," he said. He flipped it. "The whole thing collapses from here." The noise in the room rose. It was not the laughter of the earlier minutes. It was something more dangerous, the quick, practiced confidence of a group of bright young people who had spent years being rewarded for catching other people's errors. Adrian lowered the chalk. He looked at the 4th line. He saw it. Professor Hayes stepped forward half a pace. "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was the voice of a woman who had seen this ending many times before in many other students, and who intended to close the demonstration cleanly before it became something cruel. Perhaps this would be a good place to stop. You have gone further than most. There is no shame in— Adrian did not look at her. He looked at the board. He could feel the weight of the room against his back. The phones lifted again, the smirks returning the silence of Professor Hayes, waiting for him to accept the out she had offered him. He thought for a short and very clear moment about the drive home, about the uniform in the washing machine, about the way a story like this would travel through a university by morning, and about how it would feel for the rest of his time at Whitmore, to push a mop past these same students in these same halls. He did not answer her. He lifted the chalk again. The hall went quiet at once, a silence more attentive than the one that had preceded it. He looked at the fourth line, then at the seventh, then at the structure of the rebuild he had drawn beneath the horizontal rule. Something in his face tightened and then loosened. He set the chalk back down on the tray. Tyler Brennan laughed once under his breath. "That's it," he said quietly to Caleb. "He knows he's finished." A few other students began to gather their things, assuming reasonably that the demonstration was over. Megan Prescott lowered her phone entirely, already composing in her head the caption she would write when she posted the clip that afternoon. Adrian stood with his back to the room and stared at the board. The error was not just a sign. He could see now that he was looking at the whole structure together, that the sign error was not the real problem. The real problem was that his rebuild, elegant as it was, had taken him slightly off the cleanest path. He had been so focused on avoiding the standard substitution that he had chosen a route that was defensible but not optimal. If he corrected the sign and kept going, he could finish the proof, but it would be a long, ugly finish, the kind that earns partial credit and nothing else. Professor Hayes watched him and misread the stillness. She stepped forward again, more gently this time, and said, "Mr. Cole, please, take your seat. You have done nothing to be embarrassed by." From the third row, someone let out a thin, pitying laugh, the kind of laugh that is worse than mockery, because it believes itself to be kind. Adrian reached up very slowly and picked up the eraser. He did not turn around. He did not respond. He raised the eraser to the board, and in a single long sweep, cleared the entire lower half of everything he had written. The room went completely silent. Every phone came back up. Every spine straightened. Professor Hayes took one step back from the board, her finger falling away from her lips, and for the first time since Adrian had raised his hand at the back of the hall, she looked at him, not as a janitor, not as a curiosity, but as a man she could not yet place. Adrian set the eraser down and picked up the chalk again. Half the board was blank now, a clean gray field beneath the upper lines he had chosen to keep. He did not turn to face the room. He stood square to the board, and for the first time since he had walked to the front, let himself breathe slowly all the way down. He started over from the horizontal rule. The path he had tried the first time had been defensible. The new path wasn't defensible. The new path was the one he had worked out in his notebook at 2 in the morning in the quiet of the lecture hall after his shift, and again on the long walk home, when there was no one to watch him try and fail and try again. He had never been sure it would hold. He was about to find out in front of a room of 40 students and a professor who had been waiting a very long time to close this particular door. His hand moved faster now. The second attempt was not a rebuild, it was a reframe. He treated the original equation not as a problem to be solved, but as a shadow cast by a simpler structure underneath, and he began to draw that structure. Within 4 lines, the problem had taken on a shape the room had never seen. Caleb Whitaker, who had been gathering his backpack, slowly set it back down on the floor. Professor Hayes stepped closer to the board. Her arms were no longer crossed. She had taken her reading glasses from the chain around her neck and put them on, and she was following Adrian's work line by line, her lips moving almost imperceptibly as she verified each transformation in her head. She did not speak. She did not step back. Behind her, the room had gone so still that the low hum of the ventilation system had become audible for the first time all morning. Adrian reached the point where the two sides of the new structure had to meet, and he hesitated for a single breath because this was the step he had never fully tested on paper. He had only done it in his head during those long walks along Cromwell Avenue, turning the logic over in the dark. He wrote the step. It held. Somewhere in the third row, a young woman named Rachel Ford let out a small, involuntary sound, something between a gasp and a laugh. Tyler Brennan did not smirk anymore. Tyler Brennan had gone very still, the color slowly leaving his face as he followed what Adrian was doing and realized line by line that he himself could not have done it. Adrian wrote the final 3 lines cleanly. He did not rush them. The last step was almost anticlimactic, a single line that closed the proof with a kind of quiet inevitability, as though the answer had been waiting underneath the original problem all along and simply needed someone willing to not take the obvious road. He set the chalk down on the tray. He did not step back from the board. He placed his hands at his sides and waited. For several seconds, no one in the room said anything. Professor Hayes stood with her glasses halfway down her nose, reading the proof from the top. Her eyes moved through the first section, then the rebuild beneath the rule, then the final lines. She read it once, then she read it again. When she reached the bottom of the board for the second time, she took the glasses off and held them in her hand. "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was careful the way a person's voice becomes careful when they are choosing each word in front of witnesses. "Would you remain at the board, please?" She walked to the lectern, picked up the marker for her tablet, and began to work through the proof on her own screen, the projection of it flickering to life on the side wall of the hall. The students watched her work. She did not speak while she worked. She checked each line against Adrian's, and at one point she glanced up at him with an expression that was not yet approval, but was no longer disbelief. It was the expression of a woman doing arithmetic on something she had not expected to have to add. When she finished, she set the marker down with the same deliberation she had set the chalk down with at the start of the morning. She turned to the hall. "The proof is correct," she said. The silence broke. It did not break into applause. It broke into a sound more complicated than applause, a low rush of exhaled breath and whispered disbelief and the scrape of chairs as students leaned forward to see the board more clearly. Megan Prescott had stopped filming somewhere during the rebuild and had not resumed. She was simply watching now, her phone face down on her desk. Professor Hayes did not stop speaking. "It is not only correct," she said. "It is better than any solution I have been given in all the years I have offered this problem." Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "The standard approach to this equation requires 14 pages of published work to complete and relies on a theorem from 1984 that was itself the subject of a doctoral thesis. Mr. Cole has just done it on a whiteboard in under 30 minutes without that theorem, using a reframing that I have not seen before." She looked at him. "Where did you learn this?" Adrian did not answer right away. He looked at the board, then at the room, then at his own hands, which were white with chalk dust at the knuckles. "I taught myself," he said. "Mostly. I had a professor a long time ago who got me started. The rest I worked out on my own." He did not say where. He did not say when. He did not offer the biography the room was now silently constructing for him. Tyler Brennan stood up. It was not aggressive. He stood the way a person stands when they feel they must acknowledge something and cannot do it from a seated position. "I'm sorry," he said, and the hall turned toward him. His face was red. "For laughing earlier. I'm sorry." He sat back down without waiting for a response, and Caleb Whitaker beside him gave him a small nod that was the closest thing to a benediction a 19-year-old could offer. Professor Hayes walked to the front row and stopped at the edge of Adrian's board. She studied the horizontal line he had drawn, the clean sweep, where he had erased everything and started over. May I ask you one more question, Mr. Cole? Yes, ma'am. Why did you erase it after the sign error? You could have corrected the sign and finished. It would have been longer, but it would have worked. She was not testing him. She was asking because she wanted to know. Adrian considered the board for a moment. Because a longer proof that works isn't the same as the right proof, he said. I could see once I stopped that I wasn't on the cleanest line. I was on a line I had picked because I wanted to be different from the textbook. That's not a good enough reason. The erasing wasn't about the sign. It was about starting from the right place. Professor Hayes looked at him for a long time. Something in her face, which had held its composure through the entire demonstration, softened by a single degree. She nodded once more to herself, then to him, and turned back to the room. Class is dismissed, she said. Read chapters 9 and 10 for Thursday. Mr. Cole, if you have a few minutes, I would like to speak with you in the hall. The students did not move right away. They gathered their things slowly, as though they were leaving a place they suspected they would never quite return to in the same form. Several of them glanced at Adrian on the way out. A few nodded. Megan Prescott stopped at the end of the front row and said very quietly, "That was incredible. I'm sorry I laughed." Adrian inclined his head. He did not have a response that felt honest, so he gave her the one that was true in its silence. When the last of them had filed out, Professor Hayes held the door for him and closed it behind them. The corridor was empty. Morning light fell in long rectangles across the polished floor. She did not speak until they had walked a few paces from the lecture hall. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I offered you a seat twice. I offered you a way out of the room. I did it because I thought I was being kind. I was not being kind. I was being condescending. I assumed I knew what you were. I was wrong about that." Adrian listened. He did not answer immediately. "You didn't know me," he said at last. "It wasn't an unreasonable assumption. It was a wrong one, but it wasn't unreasonable. It was both," she said. "I have been in this building for a long time. I have seen brilliant people come through it. I have also seen a great many people praised as brilliant who were only well-credentialed. I should know the difference by now. I have no excuse." They walked a few more steps. She stopped at the window at the end of the corridor, where the ivy ran thick along the stone, and looked out. "There is a research position opening in my department in the fall," she said. "It is funded. It is modest, but it is funded. It would not require you to leave what you are doing immediately. It would require you to do work that matters under my supervision, at a desk, in an office, with your name on the door. If you are interested, I would like to be the person who recommends you for it." Adrian did not answer right away. He looked at his reflection in the window, the gray uniform, the name badge, the quiet man it contained. He thought about the drive home, and about the washing machine, and about the notebook in his back pocket, and about the professor in Ohio who had written years ago that he was the most original mind in the department. He thought about how long it had been since anyone had used that word in a sentence about him. "I'm interested," he said. "Good," said Professor Hayes. "Then come to my office on Friday at 3. Wear whatever you like." She offered him her hand. He took it. The handshake was brief and firm, and in its way more significant than anything either of them had said. He returned to the lecture hall to collect his bucket and his keys. The board was still covered in his work. He looked at it for a long moment, at the two halves of the proof, the abandoned one above the line and the completed one below it, and then he picked up the eraser and cleared it, the way he had cleared 1,000 other boards in 1,000 other nights, with the same unhurried motion and the same unreadable face. He walked out of the building into the cold morning air. The campus was moving around him, students with coffee cups and backpacks, a groundskeeper running a leaf blower across the lawn. No one who passed him on the path would have known looking at him that anything had changed. He walked the way he'd always walked. He carried the bucket the way he always carried it. But there was a different weight inside his chest now. something that had settled quietly into place during the long sweep of the eraser, and it did not feel like triumph. It felt like a door that had been locked for a very long time beginning at last to move. In the hall behind him, Professor Hayes stood for a moment longer at the window. She did not think of Adrian Cole as a janitor anymore. She did not think of him as a curiosity or a story she would tell at a faculty dinner. She thought of him the way she thought of the few people in her life whose minds had made her better at her own work. And she understood with a clarity that surprised her that a title on a door had never been what made a person worth listening to. It was the only lesson her classroom had taught her that morning, and she was the one who had needed to learn it. Knowledge does not belong to a uniform, or to a name, or to the row a person sits in. It belongs to whoever is willing in a silent room to raise a hand.